So, my name's Kristian. Hello and welcome. And are you all right there? And I want you to document all the things. So what I want from you is, I want you to write more documentation, and I want you to write better documentation. So, when I say documentation, what do I mean? My first instinct as, someone with a software development background, I think of software documentation, I think of product documentation. But process documentation is a thing too. Do you have a job? Does your job have clear written policy regarding expenses, or is it just a wing it kind of thing? Has someone written down what you do in the event there's a fire? That's important documentation. They're all examples of documentation. Why does it matter, though? Well, the fire example, I guess you kind of get. That's fairly obvious, right? But there's more to it than that. So documentation, it's scaling for knowledge. So please, put your hand up. Who here works on, who here scaling software for them, making sure their software scales? Is that important for you? Is that the kind of thing you work on? Right. Keep your hands up. Put them up in the first place. And keep them up if you're happy about the quality of your documentation. And I'm not sure there's a hand left standing. Oh, we've got one. Well done. Oh, well, yeah. Okay, fine, you're from Django, you're cheating. Well done. So most institutions run on the model of, we'll ask Alex, or Bobby, or Charlie, or whoever. That doesn't scale. Sometimes Alex is away, sometimes Alex is off sick, on holiday. Maybe Alex had a freak, really weird, unfortunate accident, broke their arms and their jaw, and now you're totally screwed. We learned long ago with software development that models based around publish, subscribe scale way better than having loads of individual clients polling for data. And it turns out the same is true for knowledge transmission. The other thing is, sunlight, best disinfectant there is. Openness and transparency matter. Do you have clearly written documentation on your interview policy, how you conduct interviews? Because if you don't, and you write some down for the first time, you can then discover that you've got Charlie. And Charlie thinks that candidates who have published open source code on GitHub are clearly superior to candidates that don't. And then you can take Charlie to one side and you can have a long talk about privilege and the biases that can creep into your hiring process because of that. Seriously, write things down and publish them. Especially the things that everyone thinks they know, everyone thinks they understand, because you will be amazed at the kind of disputes, conflicts, arguments, and enlightenment that comes from the discussions when there's a clearly written canonical form. On a fairly software-specific note, though, error messages, they are a form of documentation too. Write an error message that you will be able to understand and react to when it's 3 a.m. and PagerDuty is playing you the song of its people. Or in fact, that somebody else will be able to understand when it's 3 a.m. and PagerDuty has woken them up. That is when you'll want a good error message. Write an error message that doesn't rely on you having loads of contextual knowledge and experience to understand and act upon it. Because if you don't have that, you're the one most likely to cause errors and need good error messaging. There's loads of guidance and advice on writing good error messages. David McKeever has written a fantastic manifesto on error reporting. I'll be putting these slides online afterwards with links to the various bits I reference. So, given all that, why is so much documentation terrible? We've established that it's mattered. I don't think anyone disputes the fact that documentation is important. Yet it's, with the exception of the Django project and a very small number of other things, no, the Django project documentation is fantastic, but it's a clear outlier. It spoils you for using other projects' documentation. So why is the general standard of documentation so low? It's important to understand this and how it happens so you can avoid making the same mistakes. Nobody wants to do bad work. Nobody sits down and thinks, right, I've written this great piece of software, I've built this great tool, I've got this great way of doing things, I'm now going to see how many people I can confuse and annoy with obscure, poorly worded documentation. Nobody actually does that. Hope not. Documentation, it's basically like flossing. You know it's good for you, you know you should do it more, but most people don't, not as much as they should. Because good documentation requires incentives, and most of the time you are not incentivized to produce good documentation. Because when you need documentation the most, sometimes you'll be reading documentation just out of curiosity or general interest. You'll be doing some sort of assessment or just reading to learn. But most of the time, you're reaching for it because you have something to do, you have a problem to solve, you don't have the knowledge, you need the knowledge, you've gone to the documentation for it. You're not there to improve the documentation, you're there to solve whatever problem it was in the first place that made you need it. And you can get into improving the documentation as you do that, but there lies the path to infinite yak shaving. As you try and work out how to fix the problem, you try and work out how to phrase it for the docs, you try and build the docs, you try and test the docs, you sign up for whatever system it is that lets you contribute back to the docs, and that original problem is still languishing there. You're not incentivized to fix it when you have the problem. When you do know more than the documentation, when you've got that knowledge and you're in the position to improve the documentation, you're often not incentivized to do so. You're busy. You've got the knowledge you need now. You know how to do the thing. You know how to solve the problem. You know how to deploy the service. You've got that knowledge. Why sit down and update the documentation when you've got so many other things that you probably need to do? The other thing good documentation needs is empathy. And basically everything is better with more empathy. Literally everything. But that's a whole other sub-talk in itself. But most importantly, you need to forget how easy it feels now that you know. 2 little words that spell doom for almost any bit of documentation. But it's obvious. That's 3 words. It's obvious. That's 2 words. Like, you weren't saying that it was obvious. You didn't feel that it was obvious when you didn't know. You didn't feel that it was obvious when you were cursing the whoever wrote the feature and failed to document the use cases, whoever designed the building and forgot to and didn't write down how you operate the alarm system. It wasn't obvious then, but once you know it, it's so easy for things to feel obvious and for you to undervalue the difficulty. You need to understand what it felt like not to know the thing. You need to put yourself in a totally different frame of mind, and that's hard. It's like saying, don't think of pink elephants, what are you all doing now? It's the whole problem. You say to someone, oh, you know about the thing, write about the thing, for somebody who doesn't know about the thing. It's 2 different competing mindsets that you need to get the documentation problem solved. And that's genuinely hard to do as one person. Because good documentation is hard. Remember that. People generally do the best job they're able to do with the resources they have. And people rarely have enough resources, whether it's time, whether it's money, whether it's all these things. It's so easy to sit there and point and say, oh, that project's terrible, it's absolutely awful, no documentation at all, utterly useless, can't believe they did that. Nobody does a bad job deliberately. They did the best they could. So, what can you do to be better? How can you create good documentation? That's a good question, and I wish I had a great answer, but here's some things that should help. Don't just document what, document why. There's a great story by Rands in Repose on his blog about specifically relating to process documentation. He says, engineers don't hate process, they hate process that can't defend itself. If someone asks you a question that affects how they spend their time, their most valuable resource, and you don't answer that question, you'll piss them off. Assumptions change, axioms change, circumstances change. And if you provide context and reasoning in your documentation, then the documentation and the instructions can change too. If you say, before we deploy this service, you'll need to run this command because there's some weirdness with database creation, and you run this command, we've got a bug around database creation. When we fix that bug later, hopefully we fix that bug later, you can then come to that documentation, know the bug's been fixed, and know that that command's not necessary anymore. You avoid the whole cargo culted, I'm just doing this because it's there. Arbitrary rules, arbitrary statements, they easily piss people off. And they piss people off even more when they're arbitrary and wrong. A follow-up to that, though, if you don't know why, documenting what is better than nothing. So I write a bunch of things using LaTeX, fantastic typesetting tool. To get a PDF out of that, I know that, yeah, exactly. I know that I run LaTeX multiple times. I don't know why. I run it once, some files get generated. I run it twice, some more files get generated. Eventually, after running it enough times, a PDF comes out. I'd love to know why. But fundamentally, just telling me that, no, just run it 6 times, you'll get a PDF. That's enough. That will get me through. That gets me past the problem. Or, hypothetical scenario, you're working on a client library for a very popular game with children, and you find that the server needs text to be encoded as not ASCII, not UTF-8, nothing useful or well-known like that. You find it needs code page 437 encoding. That's a fun text encoding. You'd love to know why the game needs that, but just knowing that that's what's needed would have saved you a lot of time and frustration. Checklists. Checklists are a fantastic tool. There's a chap called Atul Gawande, and I really hope I pronounced that right. He wrote a book about how people benefit from checklists to get complex procedures right. He's a surgeon. He gets things wrong, people die. That's quite bad. That certainly puts a lot of my problems into perspective. He's got a great book on the subject, The Checklist Manifesto, but very short summary. Checklists are an incredibly useful documentation tool generally, and they help reduce error rates in complex procedures performed under stress. So your ops team, they've got a PagerDuty alert, 3 in the morning. Give them a checklist so they don't miss things. Buildings on fire, give people a checklist so they make sure that not only that they evacuate safely, but everyone else is too. Simple tool, incredible results. Another thing you can do, and I need to be very careful about this, you can stop answering questions. I'm not saying that you should start telling your colleagues, your users, whoever, to go away when they have questions. I'm saying that if these people are asking you questions, that's probably a sign that your documentation could use improvement. So try to answer them in the form of improved, better documentation. Take their question, use it as a learning point. Obviously, try and give them an answer there if you can, so they can get on with whatever problem it is they're trying to solve. Don't be a dick, but use the fact that they're asking, that they don't know, that they've had to come to you, use that as a learning tool and improve your documentation based on it. Something I'm only just starting to experiment with, pair documentation, is going really well at the moment. So I'm guessing a bunch of you have probably heard of pair programming or pair programmed yourselves. Pair documentation, same sort of concept. You get 2 people, you get one who knows all about the thing, one who doesn't at all. You get them to do the thing and improve the documentation as necessary afterwards. At that point, you've helped with empathy because you've got both sides. You've got the knowledge, you've got the lack of knowledge. You've helped with incentives because an explicit part of the task for them to do is to improve the documentation. You've ticked the boxes. It's a great way to just see your documentation rapidly improve, whether it's doing releases, it's interviewing, it's installing some software, whatever it is. As far as tooling goes, static sites, utterly fantastic. GitHub Pages makes this ridiculously easy. It is, unfortunately, not the easiest for non-technical audiences. They're working on that. The GitHub web editor is a great tool. GitHub Pages you can make with a couple of clicks through the site. It's fantastic, it's straightforward. Or there's Sphinx and Read the Docs, great among the Python community. And static sites, I think, are so much better than wikis, because wikis are the RCS of documentation. Seriously. So for those of you who don't know what RCS, it's version control software that makes CVS look good. And CVS, so that's version control software that makes SVN look good, and SVN, well, it's not Visual Source safe. Seriously, though, the wiki model of things is I made some changes to the documentation. You can revert them if you notice and if you like, or you can just keep adding more on top. And the 90s called that wasn't a great way to write software. People worked that out then. It's not a great way to maintain documentation. So there's this great model, this great workflow, whereby somebody proposes a change, people discuss it, maybe improve it, then it's either accepted or rejected, and that's a whole lot better, whether you're using patches on a mailing list or GitHub pull requests. You get transparency, you get openness, you get collaboration, and you get lower barriers to entry too. Just like Daniele said earlier, with the accessibility to a project with documentation, making it easier for people to contribute is important. Because you can get people turn up and say, I don't know what this paragraph of the documentation meant. I was utterly confused by it. I think it should say this. But I don't know, because I'm still new to this. So here's my proposed change. Help me work with it. Whereas a wiki gives you very much I can dive right in and make some changes and hope for the best, or I can move on because I don't feel like I know enough. Ultimately, though, there's no silver bullet. I wish there was. These are my observations. These are my opinions. If you've got ideas, if you've got insights, please let me know. I'm Googleable. I'm on the Twitters at Do I Smell Burning. I'm here till Monday night. Thank you very much. Shout louder.
Okay.
Or maybe not for recording purposes.
I was going to say that Stack Overflow is really the thing that has meant that I are able to find solutions to my problems much quicker than I ever used to do. So do you know of any teams or projects that tried to basically just have a Stack Overflow model where everyone has a problem?
Instead of answering a question face to face, they always ask in a searchable place, that can then be answered in a model similar to Stack Overflow where answers get voted up, and that method of creating documentation rather than literally trying to document the whole system.
Do I know of teams using Stack Overflow-like models? I'm afraid I don't. Does anyone?
There are some products which use Stack Overflow.
Right.
Tag on Stack Overflow.
Sounds good. Sounds like a great tool. Sounds like an easy way to build collaborative things. It's not necessarily the ideal structure, because it's very question and answer based, and there's a lot to be said for well-structured prose documentation like the Django documentation, which I'm going to keep plugging now. I've been led into it. No, but it is fantastic. But yeah, that's a perfectly workable model.
I recently tried to start using a piece of software, RSnapshot, if anyone's heard of it, where the how-to document was completely missing. It was all linked to on the website, but it had just been taken down. And apparently this was because the developer wanted to convert it to the Markdown format, but he hadn't got around to doing that yet and didn't consider it important. How do you think the best way is to make people work on documentation that might not be important to one person, but is overall a piece of documentation that was there and should be there?
So my understanding of RSnapshot is it's a free piece of open source software, right?
Yeah.
And there are some very beautiful blog posts about, you ask how to make people produce good documentation. At that point, you're demanding that people work for free for you. In fact, David McKeever has a fantastic blog post on the subject. That's actually my stock answer for many, many things. How do you generally incentivize, as a user of things, people, producers of things that you use? That's a big and very deep question. And when it comes to free software, I think you kind of have to take what you're given. It's ask for a refund. No, sorry, that's flippant of me, but it's a hard problem. People do the best they can.
Actually, I have a little bit of an answer to that question,
Thank
which
you,
is
please.
to make sure that it's very valued throughout the community, so that writing documentation is not what the people who aren't good enough to be programmers do. It's the thing that gets you the most applause and thank yous and so on from the people who are right at the center of the project. So yeah, I think
No, that's
you
a great
can't do it
point.
by yourself, but if you have enough people making a big noise about it, you do find that you get people thinking, oh yeah, this is valuable too.
Absolutely. Though that's the kind of thing that has to come from within the project. It's hard to, as an external user of a tool, how do you incentivize the tool to be better?
There's a surefire way to do it. You just put out your own documentation, which is blatantly wrong, and the whole internet will race to correct it. So
Now that's nice. That's somewhat misanthropic. Because, yeah, I mean, that's a great quip, but think of all the people that will hit that not realizing that it's the wrong documentation. If they're not in on the joke, you've just excluded a whole category of new people that were desperately searching for something, finally think they've found the Holy Grail, and it's not just wrong, it's deliberately wrong.
Is there still a role for technical authors?
Almost certainly.
Why aren't we
Writing
using
documentation is a skill. Writing good documentation is a skill. Combining that ability to communicate effectively well with written language and the technical knowledge, that's a niche combination of skills. Do I need to switch now?
No, just keep
Keep
on the
going.
questions about the project.
Just on that, I work at work with some brilliant technical authors. They sometimes give out sweets to software programmers who write documentation that's useful to them.
Great question. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.